Welcome to The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. I'm Bria Baker with my amazing co-host Jameer Burley, and today we're talking about these continued wars on DEI, which is this administration's code for Black folks, and how it's extended to the education.
Yep, this is exactly what Republicans said that they were going to do via the Project 2025, and the attacks have only grown more intense over the last few months, pulling funding from colleges and universities, rewriting government websites, and expanding book bans. We're going to break it all down over the next few minutes.
And of course, we have to start with the headlines, what's tracking in the news, what needs to be fixed in the news. First up is this headline from MSNBC. Our beloved Jackie Robinson, which some of you may know is also a war veteran. The Defense Department recently tried to take down all mentions of him and his military service on the defense website, and then backtracked when they got obvious backlash to that, calling it a war on woke, which is mind-blowing because how are you all reporting on your own veterans? Is that too woke for you? But they just want to remove any mentions of Black folks contributing to this society.
Yeah, I mean, it's a reminder that oftentimes folks look at Black history as somehow separate from American history. And America would not be what it is without the historical events and strives and attributes and really the contributions of Black folks have made throughout the history of this country. And Jackie Robinson is no one whose history should be rewritten or erased from our government websites, especially when he, broke through so many different color barriers, whether we're talking about the military or Major League Baseball.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. It's also just mind blowing because thankfully, as we saw in that headline, the GOP did backtrack and restore his information. But there are so many Black veterans who had their information pulled down, and it's not going to be replaced because they're not famous, because they did not win awards as a Major League Baseball player. But their contributions are no less important. It's mind-blowing to see that you could give up everything for this country, and a century later or half a century later, they can remove all proof that you were even a part of keeping this society going. So yeah,
it's a reminder why the resistance is so important, because had people not spoken up and had this amazing online and in-person outcry about his history being rewritten or really erased, we would not have seen the backtrack. So again, for those who think that protest and advocacy does not work, here is a clear example of what happens when people do stand up and speak out. We can actually, we're able to, not in all instances, but in many instances, protect the history and the rights of people who look like us.
Yeah, that's so important, which is especially, I mean, I know your headlines, we need to be resisting so much.
Well, yeah, in that vein, unfortunately, as we saw late last year and really over the last few months leading into the new year, the continuation of book bans that is happening across the country. And actually, my two headlines focuses on that as someone who considers themselves to be an avid reader. The Alabama board is defunding local libraries' ability to have a wide range of books from a number of art authors, including LGBTQ members of the C community, and they are removing many of these books from the local library, saying that they're inappropriate. And it's a reminder of who gets to decide what is appropriate or inappropriate, what is history and not history in this country. It's oftentimes those who have a vested interest of creating a particular narrative of America that's not representative of the facts.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. And this is definitely one of those moments where it's like, I want to rewrite this headline, because they're not defunding the library over complaints about inappropriate books. They're defunding the library because they don't want to tell the truth and they're trying to rewrite history. And so to pull resources from what is supposed to be a tax-funded entity. So you're manipulating dollars that come from citizens to make sure that citizens don't have to be faced with the facts of what they've survived, what people who don't look like them have survived. And it's just mind blowing. It's really mind blowing.
And most of this is coming from conservative parents who unfortunately do not want their child to have a full understanding of the world around them, and is trying to indoctrinate them into this belief that there is no flaws that are faults that have ever happened from the American government. And I think it really places their children at an academic and social and political disadvantage, where they're not going to be able to show up in the world as a full citizen, because they're going to lack so much knowledge and understanding of how the world has and is working.
Yeah, that's so, so true. And I saw that a lot of the books that caused this uproar were books about the LGBTQ community. And as a queer person, it's just always frustrating to see this because kids are inundated with content
Yeah.
that is very sexual in nature. But when it's heterosexual couples, when it's straight couples, that's okay. Your kids are being told that they're going to be heartbreakers because they're cute. They're being told, "Oh, do you like that boy?" when they're little girls. Like there's constant sexual innuendos that are pushed onto kids. But God forbid there be a YA coming of age book about two girls who like each other, about two young men who are of age and it's appropriate for them to actually be interested in one another. And all of a sudden that's inappropriate. So it's just always frustrating to see that double standard that people are like, well, I just don't think it's appropriate for my kids. And it's like, your kids are watching movies about Disney princes and princesses where their whole life revolves around getting the guy.
Exactly. And that's indoctrination indoctrination of heterosexual norms have always been accepted in society. And I'm happy that you brought it up because my second article is actually regarding the PEN. PEN America did a research and showed that the vast majority of the books across the country are books that are related to LGBTQ, people of color characters, out of the traditional norm, mainstream America stories around heterosexual relationships. And I just want to remind folks that, stories of Black folks, stories of women, stories of transgender, stories of queer folks have existed throughout history. Just because we now have access to those stories via books and online and movies and videos does not erase the long history of how these folks have always existed within society.
So true. So true. And I think it also goes to show that, we have to band together and build solidarity because they're coming for Black folks and people of color at nearly the same rates as they're coming at LGBTQ folks. And they're going to use one group to scapegoat and target the other. And so these bands but ultimately this is really like they are cherry picking what we can and cannot learn about, what books we can and cannot access. And so it's very terrifying to know that it is so hard. As a first-time author, it is so hard for Black authors to get a book greenlit and published. And when those books get published, then we need to fight to make sure that they can stay on library shelves. It's just mind-blowing and really, really frustrating because it's going to make it that much harder for publishers to say yes to these books, knowing that it's a risk. It's a real liability. They need to have their legal department shored up whenever they take a chance on a book by a Black or queer author or a book that centers Black and queer characters. And that is just the reality of this world. Not just our country, but this world. And so we're putting American children at such a disadvantage that they're not going to know anything about the world beyond their borders because it is being blocked by white male conservatives, predominantly, and the people that they are brainwashing into believing this is what's going to save your children.
Yeah. And also, this is always the criticism that America has had for dictatorships, right? The idea that that a government could limit its citizens' ability to access knowledge and resources by banning books. Let me remind you, there's no government or society in history who have fought to ban books or some form of education who have been on the right side of history. That has never been the case. So it just goes to show you who is using this to weaponize, for distraction, right? Because if we're focused on book banning and we're focused on the small acts, and I say small compared to the other things, they're devastating, then we're not focused on what they're really doing and all the devastation is that are happening behind the scenes, like an article eliminating the Department of Education.
Right. Yeah, it definitely scaffolds up. It's part of a bigger strategy. So they start by banning books on local levels, defunding libraries on local levels, eliminating parts of curriculum, AP classes that are about Black history and whatnot. And it's a part of this larger attack. So my final headline is that the White House is preparing an executive order to abolish the Department of Education. Really insanity, really insane. Number one, because you cannot dismantle the U.S. Department of Education or a department in general, a federal agency, through an executive order. But Trump is planting seeds, is pushing fear. They've already been firing people, letting people go, taking away funding from colleges and universities. And this is really scary because, number one, a lot of states get their funding for their education systems from the Department of Education. So if they're able to dismantle the Department of Education. For example, the state that I live in, the state of Georgia, gets about 20% of its funding from the U.S. Department of Education. How are we going to make up that gap? where are we going to find that money? And the schools are not that great anyway. So for school districts locally that are already struggling and depend on so many federal dollars, what are they going to do? But also we need national mandates. That's why federal agency exists, so that we can set the tone. And to your point, these local efforts scaffold up to this national effort to really dismantle any attempt at nationwide intellectualism, any attempt at nationwide standards of education. There's a meme that's been going viral that I think is so important. It says, tyrants view educated citizens as their greatest enemy. Slaveholders stop the enslaved from learning to read. Nazis burn books. Dictators censor media. That's why Trump is attacking education, science, museums, and the arts to prevent us from learning. It's fascism 101. I mean, there's no clearer case for it. And for all of the folks who are saying we're behind, we're only going to get more behind other nations. We're only going to be further dependent on the brains and the brilliance coming from other places, because we don't have reading comprehension. We can't do math. People don't have an attention span. And that's only going to worsen when they're getting their news from clickbait and Joe Rogans of the world, and they're not able to get like deep, nuanced storytelling and talk about it with a professional who went to school to help, moderate these sorts of conversations. It's really scary.
No, I fully agree. I think there's a huge misconception about what the Department of Education does. And the four things that I think are really important is, one, as you mentioned, the Department of Education helps to oftentimes fill the gap where local school districts cannot, to ensure that everyone has access to a high quality, affordable, free education, right? The second is creating standards, right? If there's no national standards around what we're teaching students, what you'll have is that in Mississippi, they'll teach students that slavery was a choice and that they were treated right. And in New York, it would be vastly different, right? And then the third that I think is really important is that it protects the rights of children with disabilities. There are a lot of children with disabilities and also minority students who oftentimes face some level of discrimination at the school level. And so the Department of Education helps to, protect those rights of those students, being able to advocate for them, but also hold individuals accountable when those needs are not being met. And the third, I totally went blank, but it's important too. But nevertheless, as someone who has worked in education for the last 17 years of my life, I can tell you that our students are at a huge disadvantage on a local and state level. And there is a misconception that if you eliminate a Department of Education, what you're going to have now is put more power back into the states to provide that education. But we know that has never been the case in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. There hasn't been a consistency across the board where states are providing equal education to all students, regardless of their economic background, regardless of their gender, regardless of their sexual orientation, regardless of their disability, and regardless of their race. So we are going to see, as you mentioned, a deterioration of what is actually being taught in the classroom, whether it is in Mississippi, Florida, California, or New York. And it's so funny that at a time where Elon Musk is saying we don't have enough people to fill certain jobs, which is why we need H-1B visas, we don't see the writing on the wall that this is only going to prevent our young people from being able to participate in the economy far beyond just being a consumer. And that's what I think people don't understand. Like, we live in such a consumerism economy, and that's only going to exacerbate over the next few years because young people are not giving the tools and resources to be able to innovate and advocate and build their own, or to be able to effectively show up in the workplace and keep and maintain their job.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. And I think what I love that you said, especially, is that word innovate, because it's not just regurgitating things that you memorized. Young people need the chance to be able to grapple with things, poke holes, ask questions, and decide, I know, and I have ideas on how to make the society better. I've tinkered with it. I've posed the questions at experts, and now I'm ready to experiment and try these new things. And we're eliminating opportunity for experimentation. We're eliminating opportunity for discussion and debate and rigor. And that's going to hurt all of us, not just those of us who are studying racism and sexism and homophobia and the humanities, but in every field. The inability to ask questions without someone shutting you down and saying, just study it the way that we are teaching it to you, is going to wreak havoc, and it's going to have so many long-term impacts. And we're already dealing with such a huge gap that was created by COVID. Yeah. There are so many, I come from a family of educators. My father-in-law is a principal, and all of them are saying that our young people have not fully recovered because we didn't fully invest in remote learning the way that we should have. And then when we came back, we didn't really account for the fact that some people were at different levels. So we're already dealing with that. And now we're just stripping young people of the opportunities to thrive and get better. It's really scary, but let's take a quick break because I'm already like worked up.
Heated.
Right, I'm heated for sure. I need where the fans at? We are going to take a quick break. You're watching The Other Side of Change only on the Black Star Network.
We begin tonight with the people who are really running the country right now.
Now, Trump is often wrong and misleading about a lot of things, but especially about history.
Donald Trump falling in line with President Elon Musk.
In the wake of the unsettling news that MSNBC has canceled Joy Ann Reid's primetime show, The Readout, Roland Martin and the Black Star Network would like to extend an invitation to all of the fans of Joy Ann Reid's MSNBC show to join us every night to watch Roland Martin Unfiltered, streaming on the Black Star Network for news, discussion of the issues that matter to you, and the latest updates on the twice impeached, criminally convicted felon-in-chief Donald Trump and his unprecedented assault on democracy, as well as co-president Elon Musk's takeover of the federal government. The Black Star Network stands with Joy Ann Reid and all folks who understand the power of Black voices in media. We must come together and never forget that information is power. Be sure to watch Roland Martin Unfiltered weeknights, 6 p.m. Eastern at youtube.com/Roland S. Martin or download the Black Star Network app.
Welcome back to The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. Before the break, we talked about the latest headlines and how the Republican Party has been waging a war against intellectualism, Black people in the education system.
1,000,000%. And this did not start yesterday. We've talked in previous episodes about how this moment builds on years of whitewashing, attacks on so-called woke culture, critical race theory panics, labeling anything remotely inclusive as DE&I. But we know that the goal has always been control of what we read, how we think, what our children learn, and honestly, also confusion. Definitely confusion too, where people are not sure of what they're allowed to talk about, what they're allowed to read about, what would get them in trouble if they discuss it with young people, with their peers, with their neighbors. It's scary.
No, and I think we oftentimes forget that books are not just like paper and ink. Right. They are cultural memories of our lives. They are the blueprints for resistance. When governments start banning books, especially books written by Black and queer folks, it's not about protecting students. It's not about protecting children. It is about silencing the truth. And I think that, to your point, is dangerous for the long-term longevity of how our country operates, especially because if we do not know our past, we are destined to repeat it.
Say that. And it's also not just about what's happening in schools. We're seeing history literally being erased from government websites, like the story of Jackie Robinson's military service, which we talked about earlier, gone. Thankfully, due to the activism, it has been brought back, but mentions of systemic racism have also been scrubbed. You see that happening on CDC websites, things related to public health, history, defense. In every area, there's so much censorship, but really that censorship is state-sponsored amnesia. They want us to collectively forget and then not have proof of what we did. It's almost like that Mandela effect or whatever it is.
Oh my God, yes.
I go up and you're like, no, it's the Berenstain Bears. And then it's like, wait, I'm only finding proof that it's the Berenstain Bears. I know in my mind it used to be different, but if you erase every example of what it used to be, it's almost like you trick people into thinking they're crazy. Like,
we're being gaslit by the government at this point.
Really, we're being gaslit by the government, which is mind blowing. I mean, everything, I can't stop saying the word mind blowing because literally it is mind blowing to feel like, okay, wait, we're in an information age where they say that everything on the internet is forever. And yet we are watching that be made not true by those with the power, those with the money, those with the elected positions. And it's really scary to know how much they control what we take in and what we ingest.
Yeah, I mean, and when you remove like Black art authors and queer folks, you are removing the stories of Black folks. You are removing the stories of women, the stories of queer folks. And you're also removing any ability for students to have any sense of identity, connection, and power. It sends a message that stories don't matter. And that what's worse is that it's dangerous to know those stories. And it's not just about, what I've come to the conclusion for me watching all of these book banning and also folks kind of rewrite our understanding of how important education is and how important the Department of Education is, and also seeing like the labor laws being erased in many states where they're now allowing students to work during school hours. We are living at a time where poor kids are going to be so disadvantaged and are going to be told that if you're not receiving a good enough education, just go start working. And that is going to have generational implications that to the likes in which we've never seen before, or at least have not seen in recent history. And so I can't say enough why it's important for us to not only just advocate to protect the books that we have already that is existing, but also to continue to force publishing houses to tell more stories of Black folks, because our stories are not to be tokenized, but also for us to get activated, right? To join the school boards, to join the PE clubs, to ensure that we are so much more versed on what our students are being taught. And you can do this long before you have a child that is of age to be a student in any of these schools.
Yeah, 1,000,000%. Number one, if you are above the age of 18, you can run for your local school board. Shout out to our girl, Ziana Bryant. She's running for her local school board. I know so many friends who have done it successfully. And it's so important that we show up because they are showing up. Whether we know it or not, conservatives are showing up in these spaces. They don't care how hyper local it is. And so these elections can be won by very slim margins. But even if you're not running for school board, even if it's just attending the meeting, again, you do not have to be a parent to care. Because ultimately, it's all going to reverberate. What starts as we're going to ban these books from this school then turns into we're going to ban it from a library, which is not age specific, which is affecting what every citizen in that community can access.
It's being taken from your online devices, right? Or
right, exactly.
Can't be sold in this country. Like those things.
Exactly.
Escalation.
1,000,000%. Exactly. It's such an escalation. And then it doesn't stop there either. So once it's barred from your schools and from your libraries, they're also barring it from the jails and the prisons. And I mean, Toni Morrison talked about how powerful it was to see her work being banned from prisons, because she's like, wow, they're really worried that my book is gonna change people's minds so much it's gonna free people. But truly, I mean, it's both a compliment and it's alarming that ultimately these spaces that are supposed to be spaces of education and rehabilitation and getting people to be better than when they entered this institution are actually not even saying the quiet anymore. They're saying it very loudly, like, we don't care about your rehabilitation. We don't care about you learning something that's going to make you a better person. We care about recidivism. We care about you staying exactly where we want you. We care about maintaining a labor force that is cheap, whether that be an incarcerated labor force, a youth-led labor force, a unskilled labor force. And so we need to recognize that this is all about building out school to prison pipelines. It's all about making sure that people stay ignorant and disconnected. And the more disconnected that we are, the easier they can make things happen, because now we don't even know. Like, hey, they're saying they're going to dismantle this institution. I don't know what it does. They've scrubbed all instances of what it does. And so maybe I didn't need it. Maybe this is effective. Maybe, and you fall for the ploys. And so we have to be informed. We have to be 3 steps ahead. We need to know what it is that they're attacking and why. Because as Jamira said, the societies that are banning these books have never been on the right side of history. So we need to be very alarmed the moment we see these attacks starting to expand, and they are expanding. Trust us.
Oh yeah, and like the idea that I think so many folks who support the closing of the Department of Education thinks that some way that the money that is going to be saved is going to somehow find its way back into their pockets. Babe, that's not how taxes work. That's not how the budget works. What is probably going to find its way into is the military budget, which we know is just a black hole at this point. Yeah. And you know, what's really frustrating to me is that it's very easy for folks to see the closing or the potential closing of the Department of Education as just a cultural issue and not realize that this is both an economic crippling issue. It is also a political issue. A uneducated population is more likely to vote conservative, right? If they're not in classrooms where they're learning about the history of other people, if they're not in community where they're learning about the history and experiences of other people, if they're not in a place where they are being taught that science is actually real, right? And can't be overlooked because of your religious beliefs. Like science is factual information that we can test and experiment and get to an actual like data-driven talking point or data-driven information point. And so folks, I need you to ground yourself in just how important this moment is. And I think each of these small steps that they're taking to dismantle our federal government, they're doing it intentionally to see how much you are willing to allow. You allow banning of trans folks, okay, that's one thing, right? Then, of course, you're not going to stand up for the book banning of Black folks. And then you're not going to stand up for the book banning of women. And then you're not going to say anything when they take books out of the classroom and they say that students can only read the Bible. All of those things have been happening and is a reflection of Project 2025. So for those who thought that the Trump administration was not attached to Project 2025, all we have to do is look at the action that he has put into place over the last 60, 70 days.
Right. Only in March.
Crazy that so much can happen, so much evil can happen in such a short amount of time. Imagine what amazing things can happen when people actually stand up and push back.
Yeah, and we have to stand up and push back. So this brings us to our next segment, because there are folks, especially young Black women, who are standing in the gap, who are fighting to protect education and reimagine what it can be. So when we come back from this short break, we'll be joined by one of those brilliant leaders, Alliyah Logan. Do not go anywhere. You're watching The Other Side of Change only on the Black Star Network.
Hello, I'm Isaac Hayes III, founder and CEO of Fanbase. Listen to what I'm about to tell you. The window to invest in Fanbase is closing. We've raised over $10.6 million of our $17 million goal. That means there's room for less than 6,370 people to invest in Fanbase for the average amount. The minimum to invest in Fanbase right now is $399. That makes you an owner in Fanbase today. Go to startengine.com/fanbase to invest. Why? Because current social apps have taken advantage of users for far too long, with content suppression, shadow banning, harmful racist content, and no real tools for monetization and equity. Fanbase has over 1.4 million users and counting, allowing anyone to reach all their following and monetize their content from day one. Social media is the new TV, and whoever owns the apps that distribute that content have the opportunity to own potential billion-dollar companies. While big platforms with uncertain futures are failing to serve their users, Fanbase is stepping up to fill the gap. Don't wait until it's too late. Invest now, invest for yourself and your future. Go to startengine.com/fanbase and own the next generation of social media.
We are back with The Other Side of Change, only on the Black Star Network. Joining us now is my good sis, Alliyah Logan. Alliyah is one of the youngest consultants at UNICEF and is the co-founder of Cultivate Global Education, where she's championing a better world through quality education, which we need now more than ever, as we said. She was also just featured on Forbes 30 Under 30 for her work in education and has met with world leaders from over 25 countries. How lucky are we to have her? Welcome to The Other Side of Change.
How lucky am I to be here? Come on. You guys are so brilliant. Congratulations on this fantastic podcast. I've been tuning in and it's so amazing.
Thank you. We appreciate you so, so much. And we're truly so glad that you're here. We need your voice. As you can tell, we were just talking about all that's going wrong and you have a really important perspective. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I think it's absolutely so concerning to see what is happening with education globally. And for all of the users and people listening today, you should be extremely concerned to see the current state of education and the abrupt changes that are being proposed in just 3 months during the Trump administration. Just imagine where we'll be at by 2028 if people don't pay attention. And I think the points that you all made were so extremely important to really factor in on what's actually happening, what's happening in schools, what's happening in local districts, and how people are actually being impacted by these decisions that are not about students' well-being. It's not about improving education. Rather, it's about monetary gain and how much money politicians and people can make off of students and off of students working instead of being in classrooms. So it's extremely disheartening. And the Department of Education is extremely important. They really make sure that students who either have physical disabilities, learning disabilities, whatever the case may be, that they're protected in schools and there's jurisdiction and implementation of civil rights and civil law within classrooms all across the country. So it's very alarming that we've seen book bans. We've seen rhetoric that children should be working instead of being in classrooms, and that they're going to support the economy, and that if they're receiving free or reduced lunch, they're actually cutting corners. There's so much rhetoric that has been seen throughout the nation that is false, and it doesn't support young people in any way. And I think one of my main concerns is with young people who are already being impacted by this, who live in the worst states when it comes to pre-K through 12 public school education, like New Mexico, Oklahoma, Alabama, Nevada, Mississippi, just a few to name, who are already struggling. What would these cuts and federal cuts do to their classroom environment, do to their education, and with enrollment from pre-K to 12? And I think looking back on COVID-19 and school closures, that had such a tremendous impact and exacerbated the already failing education system in the United States. But now that those young people are in elementary school or in middle school or going on to high school, seeing these cuts further just shows that this generation and the current generation enrolled in pre-K through 12 are being failed. And it is very alarming to see that their education is being attacked in unprecedented ways.
Yeah. Alliyah, historically, we know that education in America prior to Black folks integrating into white schools was high quality education. We also know that college used to be free before Black folks started integrating into those universities. And as all of us are Black women, I think it would be remiss of me to not mention, that Black women are currently one of the fastest growing, highly educated women, highly educated people in the United States. Tell us a little bit more of how education has led you to this work and why it has been important to your own life and why you continue to advocate for it, both on the local and international level.
Absolutely. I think education to me has always been so important. Education is elevation. And as you all mentioned prior to, when a group of people is uneducated, it's so easy to control them. When they aren't educated on their culture or historical backgrounds, it's easier to be sold propaganda and lies. So for me, I actually started my education work in New York State, where I saw that with the American Civil Liberties Union and the New York Civil Liberties Union, where I saw that in New York, even within the United States, a country that has such a high GDP and such a which should have such a great education system, that there were still failing aspects throughout each state, and specifically in my home state. So I really advocated to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. And I looked a lot at punitive measures that actually impacted Black girls and Native girls and Black boys the most when it comes to suspension rates and at a disproportionate rate. So I looked at that specifically and said, what is going on in public school education where young people are facing punitive measures instead of restorative justice practices. And then from there, I really started having conversation with girls internationally, realizing that this was an issue that was occurring in almost every country and every region of the world, where girls were being impacted in different ways by punitive measures or lack of resources or lack of investment. And I really wanted to advocate to say, how can we convince world leaders? How can we convince people regionally to invest in education, not just because it's important for them to do that, and they should do that, but then also convincing them and saying, well, you're actually going to be improving your country's GDP per capita. You're going to be improving your economy by investing in girls and investing in education. And it's so sad that you have to put a monetary value on education to convince people to educate young people, but it's the reality of the world that we live in. And of course, there should be efforts to reimagine education in a way that is productive, where students' voices are at the forefront of every decision made, and we really promote positive learning experiences. And like you mentioned, those stats with Black women and Black girls being the most the highest rate of people being educated within this country, it is unfortunate to now see that there are this rhetoric and appeal to trying to remove like the Department of Education and dismantling education as itself, because we know how dangerous that can be.
Yeah. Ooh, you said so much important things just now. But what I really loved is that you talked about how education is supposed to be student centered. And right now we're seeing anything but. It's very focused on what the adults in the room are most comfortable with, what the parents, what the elected officials, but like, what about students and young people? And you brought up briefly before what's happening in different states, but yeah, what are you hearing from students about what they're thinking about, the state of education right now, especially in those states like Florida and Texas, or, southern states, which are not predominantly white states. Like most Black people in America live in the South still. 55% of Black Americans live in the South. So we are also there too. But yeah, what are you hearing from young people there?
Students are just so concerned, and it's extremely disheartening to see that, so many young people who, again, were in their education during COVID-19 are now facing these impacts where it's the possibility of losing funding, the little funding that they even received from the federal government, and the little funding that they had from their state government and on a local level. So students are extremely disheartened. And I think that we're in a time where there's so much misinformation being spread, but within that, because of social media, we're really able to share information widely and reach a wide audience of people. And my concern is that with this administration, the plan is to make sure that, so many headlines are coming out, you're not paying attention to what's actually going on, and then you're ignoring policies that are happening. But I think young people have been extremely engaged from all sides of the political spectrum and from many different backgrounds with advocating for education and advocating for their education. And for me, I'm so concerned about students living with physical disabilities or learning disabilities, those living below the poverty line. 2.5 million children throughout America experience homelessness annually, and schools are a safe haven for them, whether it's accessing free and reduced lunch, having a safe place, having community. This is something that is extremely vital to every young person's life, to have a fundamental place to be able to learn. And I think even with students who are undocumented, those in the foster care system, those whose parents are not engaged, this is a very alarming and hard time. I mean, even the education secretary now, she said she wants to return authority over education to the states and to local communities, and to allow parents to be in control. But the unfortunate reality is, for students who don't have that family unit, for students who don't have a community to depend on, they're going to fall through the cracks. And there's no support for them. And this is the purpose of the Department of Education, is to ensure that no matter your zip code, no matter your background, your financial background either, that you're able to have a strong and basic education. And I would argue within my work, I've been advocating to have an equitable education, which is one of the words that are like, that have been banned, that you can't say anymore, that it's like way too woke to say equitable now. But it is important to have equitable education and to ensure that every student has the resources that they need as an individual and as a larger collective to succeed.
Yeah. This feels like a very full circle moment because attacks on education have always gone hand in hand with authoritarian politics. How do we fight back? From your perspective as someone who has been a youth advocate for so long, who has worked on both the domestic and international level, how do we fight back, especially when those attacks are happening, not just, as a cultural war, but also on the policy level?
Absolutely. I think we fight back in such different ways. I've been extremely impressed by the ways that people have been fighting back, whether it's students, whether it's people, lawyers or attorneys, whether it's larger organizations, have really been advocating for education and fighting back against any of the administration's attempt to essentially make sure that people are uneducated and destroy history and make sure you forget history and historical things that have happened throughout this country and throughout the world. So I've seen people who have online links to different books that have been proposed to be banned in different counties and in different states. I've seen people who have started GoFundMes for education and for books and for resources. And I've seen a lot of community. And I think that's something that is so important. When you see these headlines, it's just a human nature to feel like as an individual, you can't change anything. And as an individual, it is easy to feel helpless. But when you're in a collective and as a community, you're really able to see the power that people have. And I think it's really up to the American people to stand up and say, we're not going to have this. We can't allow these things to happen. And although they seem small, they all add up. When you're looking at like child labor laws and proposing to have children working instead of being in schools, these are all very, very smart and calculated attacks on education. And I think there's a rhetoric that, this current administration is uneducated or that they don't know what they're doing. And I think that is very alarming to think. They're very calculated and they know the steps that they need to take to ensure that people around the country, especially Black people, stay uneducated and remain living under the poverty line or those who do live under the poverty line. So it's very important to stay organized. And I think what I've learned working internationally is that there's so much more power in numbers and understanding that we should be advocating for things together instead of as an individual. So I've really seen so many different people around the world advocating for funding, for spaces for students, gender transformative education curriculum to be implemented in their states and in their schools. And I have even seen and worked with organizations like the XQ Institute. And they're so fantastic. And you guys should research them. They do advocacy and just rethinking the high school experiences. So there's organizations, there are people out there that are doing the work. It's really about continuing momentum and not feeling helpless, like feeling that you are on your own, where rather you should be feeling more energized to be involved in different and various ways. But I've been extremely impressed to see how people have been really engaged. And it's hard to be positive during this time, but it is important to say that, we have to stay focused. We have to advocate for education because we know what works and we know what doesn't work. What doesn't work is what's currently happening and what has been happening throughout this country. And what we need to do is really reimagine education where students' well-being and interest and educations are at the forefront of all decisions.
So true. And shout out to XQ Institute. They have a really great documentary called The First Class, which people can watch online for free. And it talks about some of the ways that they're reinventing high school education, making it more interactive, more innovative, encouraging students to ask questions and to not purport that there's a right or a wrong answer, but there's a story that we've unveiled and a truth from history, but also there's ways that we are making history each day. So definitely love that shout out. Also, I appreciate you talking about your international work. And I am curious how these attacks are shaping international perspective on the US, because we are global citizens. And so what we do affects other people, but also it affects how we are looked at by other people. So you're doing a lot of work internationally. What is the conversation with some of the folks that you're working with on that global scale when they see what's happening in the US?
I think it's it's humiliating. It's sad to see that the United States has taken such like a complete 180 on the highway at that when it comes to human rights, civil rights, and even investments in different organizations and investments in humanitarian aid, like with the defunding of USAID and the impact that has had globally. I think America and the current administration can't just come in and say we're not going to do this anymore if we for decades have been supporting humanitarian aid and was supposedly the forefront of democracy and like human rights and well-being. I think it's embarrassing to say the least, and I think other countries are noticing and witnessing that the United States is falling behind when it comes to its promises of being a beacon of hope for people internationally. And I think, unfortunately, it's setting an example of the wrong things to do when it comes to human rights, education, girls' rights in those instances. And there's so many countries around the world that are unfortunately also failing with education. I've seen the recent attacks for just girls' livelihood in Afghanistan, which is so unfortunate to see. But it is even worse when the United States isn't setting a proper example of what human rights and humanitarian law should look like within a country. So it's been a difficult time, but even within that, there's so many Americans who have continued to reiterate the importance of having various aid being given to countries around the world, having Americans have access to human rights. And I think it's difficult because in the United States, there's always this push to focus more on civil rights and civil liberties than looking at human rights. So America has always been engaged with different organizations like the United Nations, but has repeatedly failed, and it hasn't even ratified the Convention on the Status of the Rights of the Child. So there's so many instances where the United States could improve itself and could ensure that it is going on the right track. But with this administration, we're taking complete 180. But it is powerful to see how people around the world are advocating for people within the United States and how that could impact children everywhere and globally. And I think it's so powerful to see how people have been giving advice for their experiences living under dictatorships, living under regimes and what they've done and organized and how they've fought back against political attacks and that we're unfortunately seeing throughout the United States. So it's so important to really stay educated and really stay engaged in what's happening internationally and seeing what Americans can do to ensure that our country doesn't go down the wrong path that is currently going down.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I'm really happy you talked about like humanitarian aid, because I think when this whole idea of America's first, that we should only focus on ourselves, forget what's happening around the world, totally negates the fact that humanitarian aid is not just a nice thing to do, but it's actually politically a safe thing to do. It helps to ensure that there is some stability and prosperity around the world. So it's less likely for folks to engage in violent activities or to join militias. And so by doing humanitarian aid actually makes us safer. And also recognizing that there are many communities around the world where children and families are victims of environmental causes, right? So they are refugees because of their communities being devastated. And so by providing humanitarian aid actually prevents less immigrants from coming to the United States, as many of those folks would be the same ones that say we have way too many immigrants. So I think folks need to, which is one of the reasons why they want to keep you uneducated, because if they're keeping you uneducated, you don't really see the connections of how our lives are so intertwined with those around the world that we can't separate ourselves from the tyranny or the displacement or the violence that is occurring elsewhere without also seeing how that is deeply impacted to what happens here to us every single day.
Exactly.
Preach, preach, preach.
So tell folks where they can stay connected to you and where they can find out more information about the work you're doing.
Absolutely. You guys can follow me on Instagram, stay closely engaged. And before I go, I wanted to read a quote by Paulo Freire. He's a Brazilian activist. And during the time of his activism, the similar things that were happening in the United States were happening in Brazil, where there was a tax on education. People living in poverty couldn't go to school. And I think it's so important for us to stay educated and to also ensure that we're looking at different leaders from around the world and throughout history who have faced similar struggles that we're currently facing and what they've done. He said, take this. He says, knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. And I think that is just such an amazing point that I really want to end off on is we have to stay connected. We have to be connected and really understand that there is more similarities and differences between all of us. So I really encourage you all, to stay connected, stay involved with so many different education work, continue listening to this podcast, and then you can find me on Instagram and on LinkedIn. No longer on Twitter or X, but I'm there.
Our own little form of resistance. We appreciate you, girl. I'm barely on there myself. I deleted the app from my phone. I would have to log in through the browser or something.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah. We appreciate you, Alliyah. Thank you so much. Y'all follow our girl.
And we'll be right back after this break. You are watching The Other Side of Change only on the Black Star Network.
What's up, y'all? Look, Fanbase is more than a platform. It's a movement to empower creators, offering a unique opportunity for everyday people to invest in Black-owned tech, infrastructure, and help shape the future of social media. Investing in technology is essential for creating long-term wealth and influence in the digital age. The Black community must not only consume tech, we must own it.
Discover how equity crowdfunding can serve as a powerful tool for funding Black businesses, allowing entrepreneurs to raise capital directly through their community through the Jobs Act.
Welcome back to The Other Side of Change. As always, y'all know the conversation is far from over, but we hope this episode helped you to clarify the stakes and the fight ahead when it comes to protecting education and our young people.
If you want to dive deeper, check out Original Sins by Eve Inwing and Schoolhouse Burning by Derek Black. You can also follow people like Alliyah Logan, who was our guest a few moments ago, and groups like PEN America, We Need Diverse Books, and the African American Policy Forum.
And as always, stay engaged, know your rights, organize, hold your representatives accountable. As Alliyah said, we have to stay organized. As Jamira said, every small action scaffolds up to something bigger. And until next time, keep pushing for a just future.
Yeah, we'll see you soon.